Listen, Europe, my plan to unite African armies was leaked, the one that would create the largest military alliance in history. That era of fragmented African militaries is over. I'm building it anyway. And I will never stop. It was your last mistake leaking it. Now get ready for what's coming. Let me tell you exactly how I'm uniting 54 African armies despite your panic. My chief of staff burst into my office. Mr. President, we have a problem. Someone leaked the Continental Military Alliance proposal. The entire plan. Every detail. Every timeline. Everything we've been preparing in secret for 6 months. I opened the folder. There it was. The African Continental Defense Force proposal. Few months of secret planning. Detailed military alliance structure. Comprehensive integration strategy. Complete plan for uniting African armies into single coordinated force. The proposal was ambitious. Unified command structure coordinating all African militaries. Integrated logistics enabling rapid continental deployment. Shared intelligence creating comprehensive awareness. Combined force of over 2 million soldiers. The largest military alliance in history. Who has the document? European intelligence agencies, French DGSE, British MI6, German BND, all of them. The leak went directly to European military headquarters. I read European intelligence assessments. French intelligence stated African Continental Defense Force would fundamentally alter global military balance. Unified African military would eliminate European influence on continent, recommend immediate action to prevent implementation. British evaluation concluded, United African Military Alliance represents existential threat to Western strategic interests. Combined African force would possess capability to resist external intervention. German assessment warned, African Continental Defense Force would create peer competitor to European military. Combined resources and manpower would rival EU capabilities. The panic was visible in every document. They're already planning countermeasures. My chief of staff said, diplomatic pressure on African governments, economic threats to alliance supporters, media campaigns questioning feasibility. I studied European response plans, France planning to pressure Francophone African nations, Britain preparing to threaten Anglophone countries, Germany organizing EU-wide opposition. They wanted to stop us by exposing the plan early, before we had diplomatic groundwork complete, before we had all African governments committed. They thought early exposure would kill the alliance. Will it work, Mr. President? No, because the need for this alliance is obvious to every African leader. The leak doesn't change strategic reality, it just forces us to go public sooner. I made the decision. We're announcing the African Continental Defense Force immediately. Today, before European pressure can organize. We go public now. I called emergency alliance meeting, secure video conference, all member nation leaders. NATO is planning Operation Sky Dominance. Europe leaked our military alliance proposal to stop us. I'm announcing African Continental Defense Force today. Make it public commitment before they can divide us. Mali's president spoke first. They approached us 2 months ago, offered $200 million for base rights. My advisors recommended accepting. I delayed decision. Now I understand why. This isn't partnership. This is occupation. Niger's leader added, similar approach to us. $150 million offer. Security guarantees. All contingent on base agreement. We're refusing. No NATO bases in Niger. Chad's president stood during the alliance video conference, his voice trembling with barely controlled fury. They surveyed locations near our capital without permission, without notification, without diplomatic courtesy, without any respect for our sovereignty. Conducted aerial reconnaissance over N'Djamena, over our presidential palace, over our military installations, over our government buildings. Sovereignty violation before even requesting access, before even approaching our government, before even pretending to respect our independence. He displayed evidence on his screen, satellite imagery showing NATO reconnaissance aircraft over Chad, flight paths documented, surveillance patterns recorded, intelligence gathering proven, French aircraft, American drones, British surveillance planes, all flying over our capital, all gathering intelligence, all mapping our defenses, all preparing for base construction, without permission, without approval, without consent, just violation, just disrespect, just contempt. His hands gripped the table edge. They photographed potential base locations. They assessed construction sites. They evaluated logistics routes. They planned occupation infrastructure, all before asking, all before negotiating, all before requesting. They decided where they would build bases in our country. They determined what land they would occupy in our territory. They planned what sovereignty they would violate in our nation, without asking us, without consulting us, without respecting us. Other leaders nodded. Similar stories, same pattern, identical contempt. Senegal's president spoke next. Same in Senegal. We detected unauthorized flights over Dakar, NATO reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, sovereignty violation. They surveyed our port facilities. They assessed our airport capabilities. They evaluated our infrastructure, planning where to build their bases, deciding what they would occupy, determining how they would control us without permission. Kenya's president added his experience. Kenya detected multiple violations, surveillance over Nairobi, reconnaissance near our military bases, intelligence gathering around our government facilities. They weren't just flying over. They were studying us, analyzing us, preparing to occupy us, without asking, without respect, without dignity. Pattern emerged clearly. NATO had approached multiple governments simultaneously with coordinated strategy, not random contacts, systematic campaign, organized pressure. Mali contacted in January. Niger approached in February. Chad pressured in March. Burkina Faso targeted in April. Senegal engaged in May. Kenya approached in June. Coordinated diplomatic pressure across 6 months. Systematic campaign designed to secure base agreements quickly. Organized effort to establish presence before African leaders could coordinate response. Divide and conquer strategy. Classic colonial tactics. Neo-colonial methodology. NATO's strategy was sophisticated. Approach nations individually, make generous offers, apply economic pressure, create urgency, secure agreements quickly, establish facts on ground, present other nations with accomplished reality, prevent coordination, avoid collective resistance, achieve expansion through fragmentation. That was the plan. That was the strategy. That was the intention. But alliance intelligence had detected the pattern, recognized the coordination, understood the strategy, shared information among members, enabled collective awareness, facilitated unified response. NATO's divide and conquer strategy failed because Africa was already coordinating, already sharing intelligence, already preparing collective response, already united. I spoke with absolute conviction. We reject all base agreements, every single one, no exceptions, no negotiations, no compromises. Every alliance member announces refusal simultaneously. Coordinated continental response, unified rejection, collective sovereignty defense. Then we expose Operation Sky Dominance publicly, show the world NATO's real intentions, reveal their unauthorized reconnaissance, display their sovereignty violations, prove their contempt for African independence, complete exposure. Mali's president agreed immediately. Mali announces rejection at 0900 tomorrow. Coordinated timing, continental unity. Niger's leader confirmed. Niger announces rejection at 0900 tomorrow. Same timing, same message, same unity. One by one, leaders committed. Chad, Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, 26 nations, coordinated announcements, simultaneous declarations, continental rejection. At 0900 tomorrow. Unified timing, collective message, complete coordination. At 0900 the next morning, coordinated announcements began across Africa. 26 African nations simultaneously declaring rejection of NATO-based proposals in their respective capitals. Press conferences in Ouagadougou, statements in Bamako, declarations in Niamey, announcements in Djamena, pronouncements in Dakar, briefings in Accra, communications in Nairobi, addresses in Addis Ababa, statements in Pretoria, continental chorus of rejection, unified voice of sovereignty, collective assertion of independence. My statement was direct and uncompromising. Burkina Faso rejects any NATO military base on our territory. We reject completely. We refuse absolutely. We deny categorically. No NATO bases. No foreign military installations. No external occupation. We reject foreign military control of our airspace. We reject NATO surveillance. We refuse Western dominance. We deny external authority. Our airspace belongs to Burkina Faso. Our sovereignty is not negotiable. Our independence is not for sale. We reject Operation Sky Dominance in its entirety. We refuse NATO expansion completely. We deny Western military occupation absolutely. Then I made the announcement that would change African security forever. And today, I announce African Continental Defense Force, Continental Military Alliance uniting African armies, unified command structure, integrated capabilities, coordinated operations, over 54 member nations, over 2 million soldiers, largest military alliance in history, complete African ownership, total continental control, absolute indigenous capability. I displayed the alliance structure on screens behind me, organizational charts, command hierarchies, operational systems, everything visible, everything transparent, everything proving this was real, functioning, operational alliance. Not proposal, not plan, operational reality. Unified Continental Command coordinating all member militaries, headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Commander appointed from rotating member nations, staff drawn from all participating countries. Decision-making authority vested in Continental Command Council with representatives from every member nation. Democratic structure, collective governance, unified command. Regional defense centers managing area operations across continent. West African Defense Center in Dakar, Senegal. East African Defense Center in Nairobi, Kenya. North African Defense Center in Cairo, Egypt. Southern African Defense Center in Pretoria, South Africa. Central African Defense Center in Kinshasa. Democratic Republic of Congo. 5 regional centers. Complete continental coverage, coordinated operations. Integrated intelligence network sharing information across all members. Real-time intelligence sharing, instant threat notification, continuous coordination, continental awareness. Collective security, unified intelligence. Joint logistics system enabling rapid deployment anywhere on continent. Shared supply chains, coordinated transportation, integrated maintenance, continental logistics, unified support. Collective capability. Combined training programs building interoperable capabilities across all forces. Joint exercises, shared standards, common procedures, continental training, unified preparation. Collective readiness. Over 2 million soldiers from 54 nations, largest military alliance in history, more personnel than NATO, greater manpower than European Union combined, unprecedented African military power, continental strength, collective capability. Mali's statement followed immediately. Mali rejects NATO bases completely. Mali refuses foreign military presence absolutely. Mali denies external occupation categorically. And Mali joins African Continental Defense Force. Continental unity replacing foreign dependence. African security replacing Western control. Collective defense replacing individual vulnerability. Mali commits fully. Mali participates completely. Mali supports absolutely. Niger's declaration came next. Niger refuses foreign bases on our territory. Niger rejects external military installations. Niger denies Western occupation. Niger commits to African military alliance. Continental coordination replacing isolated weakness. African capability replacing foreign dependence. Collective strength replacing individual vulnerability. Niger joins completely. Niger participates fully. Niger commits absolutely. Chad's announcement followed. Chad rejects NATO expansion. Chad refuses foreign military presence. Chad denies external control. Chad commits to African Continental Defense Force. Continental security replacing Western dominance. African defense replacing foreign occupation. Collective protection replacing individual exposure. Chad joins fully. Chad participates completely. Chad commits absolutely. One by one, alliance members announced their positions. Senegal, rejecting NATO and joining African Continental Defense Force. Ghana, refusing foreign bases and committing to Continental Alliance. Kenya, denying external occupation and participating in unified defense. Ethiopia, rejecting Western military presence and hosting Continental Command headquarters. South Africa, refusing NATO expansion and contributing advanced technology. Cameroon, denying foreign bases and joining continental security. Tanzania, rejecting external control and committing to African alliance. Uganda, refusing Western occupation and participating in unified defense. 26 nations, 26 rejections, 26 commitments. Continental unity, coordinated sovereignty defense, collective security. Then I released the documents that would shock the world. NATO's Operation Sky Dominance plans in complete detail, 15 planned base locations with specific coordinates, construction timelines showing rapid deployment, budget allocations totaling billions, personnel deployment schedules, equipment installation plans, operational procedures, complete NATO strategy for African occupation, all documented, all proven, all exposed. European intelligence assessments showing panic at African military unity, French DGSE analysis. African Continental Defense Force would eliminate French military influence in former colonies. Recommend immediate action to prevent implementation. British MI6 evaluation. Unified African military represents existential threat to UK strategic interests in Africa. Strongly advise diplomatic efforts to block formation. German BND assessment. Continental African alliance would create peer competitor to European military capabilities. Urgent coordination with NATO partners necessary. Complete European panic. Total Western anxiety. Absolute neo-colonial fear. All documented, all proven, all exposed. Everything proving Europe feared unified African military more than any other development. More than economic independence. More than political sovereignty. More than diplomatic autonomy. Military unity terrified them most, because military unity meant they couldn't intervene, couldn't occupy, couldn't control, couldn't dominate. Military unity meant African independence was real, permanent, irreversible. International media exploded with coverage. African nations form largest military alliance in history. Europe panics at Continental Defense Force. Unified African military rivals NATO in size and scope. 2 million soldiers. Unite under African command. Continental Alliance challenges Western military dominance. Headlines everywhere. Coverage continuous. Analysis extensive. Global attention focused on Africa. On sovereignty. On independence. On unity. CNN broadcast special coverage. Historic moment in African security. 26 nations simultaneously rejecting NATO expansion and announcing Continental Military Alliance. Unprecedented coordination. Revolutionary development. Potential game changer for global military balance. BBC provided extensive analysis. African Continental Defense Force represents fundamental shift in continental security. Unified command. Integrated capabilities. Over 2 million soldiers. If operational, would be largest military alliance in history. Implications for European interests significant. Implications for NATO expansion profound. Al Jazeera offered continuous coverage. African nations asserting sovereignty through military unity, rejecting Western military presence, building indigenous defense capabilities. Continental Alliance challenging neo-colonial security arrangements. Historic development, revolutionary change. European governments issued statements within hours. Predictable responses, critical assessments, worried analyses. French Foreign Ministry statement. France questions necessity of African Continental Defense Force. Existing security partnerships provide adequate defense for African nations. Bilateral arrangements have served African security effectively. Continental Military Alliance risks destabilizing carefully balanced regional security architecture. France recommends reconsidering this approach. France stands ready to discuss alternative security arrangements. Translation obvious to everyone. France afraid of losing military influence in Africa. France terrified of losing military bases in former colonies. France panicked about losing ability to intervene in African affairs. France desperate to prevent African military independence. France trying to preserve neo-colonial military arrangements. British Defense Ministry statement. United Kingdom concerned about African military integration. Complex security environment in Africa requires flexible bilateral arrangements between nations. Continental command structure may prove ineffective for addressing diverse regional threats. UK recommends maintaining existing security partnerships. UK prepared to discuss enhanced bilateral cooperation. Translation clear to all observers. Britain worried about losing military bases in Africa. Britain concerned about losing intelligence access across continent. Britain anxious about losing ability to project power in African regions. Britain attempting to prevent African military unity. Britain defending neo-colonial security relationships. German Foreign Office statement. Germany recommends careful consideration of continental military alliance proposal. European partners stand ready to discuss security cooperation alternatives. Rushed implementation of complex military integration risks strategic miscalculation. Germany suggests comprehensive dialogue before proceeding. Germany offers to facilitate discussions between African nations and European security partners. Translation transparent to everyone. Germany trying to delay implementation of African alliance. Germany attempting to create time for European pressure to work. Germany hoping to prevent African military unity through diplomatic obstruction. Germany protecting European military interests in Africa. Germany defending Western security dominance. NATO issued formal statement within 6 hours. NATO notes African Continental Defense Force proposal with interest. Questions remain about compatibility with existing security arrangements in Africa. NATO partnerships with African nations have contributed significantly to continental security. NATO remains committed to cooperation with African partners. NATO suggests dialogue about how continental alliance would interact with existing security frameworks. Translation obvious to all. NATO threatened by peer competitor in Africa. NATO worried about losing influence over African militaries. NATO concerned about African military independence. NATO attempting to maintain control through partnership language. NATO defending Western military dominance disguised as cooperation offer. I responded publicly within 1 hour of European statements. Press conference broadcast globally. European governments question African Continental Defense Force necessity. Let me explain why their opposition proves necessity, why their concern validates our decision, why their anxiety confirms our strategy. France claims existing partnerships provide adequate defense. But let's examine what adequate defense means to France. Adequate defense means African nations remain dependent on French military support. Adequate defense means France maintains military bases across former colonies. Adequate defense means France retains ability to intervene in African affairs. Adequate defense means French interests are protected, not African sovereignty. Those partnerships serve French interests, not African security. France maintains military bases to project French power, not protect African populations. France deploys troops to defend French economic interests, not African independence. France conducts operations to preserve French influence, not African sovereignty. Britain suggests bilateral arrangements are superior to continental alliance. But let's understand what bilateral arrangements mean for Britain. Bilateral arrangements mean individual African nations negotiate separately with UK. Bilateral arrangements mean Britain can pressure nations individually. Bilateral arrangements mean divide and conquer tactics work effectively. Bilateral arrangements mean African nations face British power alone, but continental unity prevents divide and conquer tactics. United African Military means Britain cannot pressure individual nations. Unified Command means Britain cannot exploit African divisions. Continental Alliance means Britain faces collective African power, not isolated African weakness. Germany recommends careful consideration, which translates clearly, delay implementation until European pressure can stop it. Germany suggests comprehensive dialogue, which means create time for diplomatic obstruction. Germany offers to facilitate discussions, which translates insert European control into African decision-making. We're not delaying. We're not creating time for European pressure. We're not accepting European facilitation. We're implementing. We're proceeding. We're building. Now, immediately, without European permission. NATO questions compatibility with existing arrangements, which reveals their real concern. NATO wants African militaries dependent on NATO support. NATO wants African security requiring NATO involvement. NATO wants African defense necessitating NATO presence. Continental Alliance creates independent African military capability. Unified Command enables African security without NATO. Integrated systems allow African defense without Western support. That's incompatible with NATO interests. That's why they question it. That's why they oppose it. Because African military independence threatens NATO influence. Within 1 month of announcements, 26 African nations had formally joined African Continental Defense Force through signed treaties. Within 3 months, 41 nations had completed membership procedures and begun integration. Within 6 months, 54 nations, every African nation had joined alliance, contributing forces, sharing capabilities, participating in unified command. Continental unity achieved. Universal participation realized. Complete African military integration accomplished. Nigeria contributed largest troop contingent, as promised. 300,000 soldiers from Nigerian armed forces. Largest military in West Africa. Most experienced forces in region. Professional army. Well-trained personnel. Combat-tested capabilities. Nigeria's contribution provided backbone of West African Defense Center, enabled rapid response capability, created credible deterrent. Nigerian leadership in continental defense essential. Nigerian participation critical for success. South Africa provided advanced technology as committed. Indigenous radar systems developed by South African engineers. Armored vehicles manufactured in South African facilities. Communication equipment produced by South African companies. Artillery systems designed by South African military industry. Technology transfer to all alliance members. Capacity building across continent. South African expertise shared freely. Continental capability enhanced significantly. Egypt deployed air defense systems as pledged. Surface-to-air missile batteries from Egyptian military stocks. Radar installations from Egyptian Air Defense Network. Anti-aircraft systems from Egyptian arsenals. Fighter aircraft from Egyptian Air Force. Egypt's contribution created continental air defense capability. Protected African airspace. Enabled sovereignty defense. Egyptian participation crucial for air superiority. Ethiopia hosted Continental Command headquarters as agreed. New facility constructed in Addis Ababa, $200 million investment by alliance members. State-of-the-art command center with advanced technology. Sophisticated communication systems connecting all member nations. Real-time coordination capabilities. Professional staff from all participating countries. Ethiopian leadership in hosting headquarters demonstrated commitment. Ethiopian contribution enabled continental coordination. Kenya established logistics hubs as promised. Major logistics center in Nairobi for East African operations. Supply depots across Kenya for regional support. Transportation networks connecting all East African members. Maintenance facilities for equipment repair. Training centers for logistics personnel. Kenyan logistics expertise enabled rapid deployment. Kenyan infrastructure supported continental operations. Kenyan contribution essential for operational capability. First joint military exercise conducted 3 months after alliance formation. Operation African Unity. Historic name. Symbolic significance. 10,000 soldiers from 15 nations participating. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Cameroon, Egypt, Algeria, 15 nations, 10,000 soldiers, coordinated operations across multiple countries, combined arms exercises, joint planning, integrated command, unified execution. Exercise demonstrated capabilities skeptics doubted existed. African armies operating with NATO-level coordination despite limited previous joint training. Professional integration achieved rapidly through intensive preparation. Sophisticated communication maintained throughout operations despite language diversity. Effective command exercised successfully despite complex organizational structure. Successful exercise proving concept worked in practice. Continental military alliance was operational reality, not theoretical proposal. European military observers were stunned by performance. Invited to observe as transparency measure. Expected disorganization. Anticipated coordination problems. Predicted communication failures. Assumed integration difficulties. Wrong on every count. African forces demonstrated professional capability, coordinated operations effectively, communicated clearly, integrated seamlessly. Observers shocked, assumptions shattered, prejudices challenged. One leaked European military assessment stated with barely concealed surprise, African Continental Defense Force demonstrates unexpected operational capability far exceeding predictions. Integration-level rivals established military alliances despite recent formation. Combined force represents credible military power capable of sustained operations. Previous assessments of African military capability require substantial revision. Strategic implications for European interests significant and concerning. Translation. Europe underestimated African military capability dramatically. Europe assumed African forces couldn't coordinate effectively. Europe believed African armies lacked professional competence. Europe was completely wrong. African military capability was real. African coordination was effective. African alliance was credible threat to European military dominance in Africa. Second exercise expanded scope significantly. Operation Continental Shield. 6 months after alliance formation, 20,000 soldiers from 25 nations participating. Doubled participation from first exercise. Expanded to include North African nations. Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Algeria, also Central African nations. Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Congo-Brazzaville, and Southern African nations. South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Zambia, Botswana, 25 nations, 20,000 soldiers. Complex multi-domain operations across land, air, and sea. Comprehensive military exercise demonstrating full spectrum capability. Exercise included air operations with fighter aircraft from multiple nations. Egyptian F-16 seconds, South African Gripens, Algerian Su-30 seconds, Moroccan F-16 seconds, Nigerian Alpha jets. Coordinated air operations. Integrated air defense. Combined air superiority missions. Professional air coordination. Exercise included naval operations with ships from coastal nations, South African frigates, Egyptian corvettes, Nigerian patrol boats, Moroccan naval vessels, coordinated maritime operations, integrated coastal defense, combined anti-piracy missions, professional naval coordination. Exercise included special operations with elite forces from multiple nations, South African Special Forces Brigade, Nigerian Special Forces, Egyptian Special Operations, Moroccan Special Forces, Kenyan Special Operations, coordinated special operations, integrated intelligence, combined direct action missions, professional special operations coordination, comprehensive military exercise demonstrating full spectrum capability across all domains, land operations, air operations, naval operations, special operations, cyber operations, information operations, complete military capability, continental coordination, professional execution. NATO analyzed the exercise with growing concern. Assessment acknowledged reluctantly. African Continental Defense Force operational capability approaches NATO standards in several key areas. Integration achieved in 6 months rivals alliances built over decades. Combined force capable of sustained operations across multiple domains. Strategic implications significant for Western military presence in Africa. Recommend comprehensive review of NATO Africa strategy. Translation. NATO recognizing African military alliance is real threat to Western military dominance. NATO understanding African forces can operate independently. NATO acknowledging African capability rivals Western militaries. NATO worried about strategic implications. NATO forced to reconsider entire Africa strategy. European strategy shifted dramatically within months, from opposition to acceptance, from resistance to accommodation, from blocking to engaging. Complete reversal, total change, absolute transformation. NATO proposed cooperation framework attempting to maintain influence. Partnership between NATO and African Continental Defense Force. Joint exercises. Information sharing. Equipment cooperation. Training programs. Mutual benefit. Language of partnership. Reality of attempted control. I responded publicly and directly. NATO proposes cooperation after trying to stop our alliance, after leaking our plans to European intelligence, after applying diplomatic pressure to prevent formation, after attempting to divide African nations, after conducting unauthorized reconnaissance over our territories. Now they want partnership. Now they offer cooperation. Now they suggest mutual benefit. We're open to cooperation, but on African terms, not NATO terms. Partnership of equals, not subordination disguised as cooperation. Mutual respect, not neo-colonial dominance with partnership language. Genuine cooperation, not Western control with diplomatic cover. African Continental Defense Force is African alliance created by Africans for African security interests. Serves African interests exclusively, not Western objectives or European priorities or NATO strategic goals. Operates under African command with African officers making all operational decisions, not NATO direction or Western guidance or European supervision. Makes African decisions through Continental Command Council with representatives from all member nations. not Western-approved choices or NATO-vetted options or European-sanctioned selections. Protects African sovereignty as primary mission and fundamental purpose, not Western influence or European dominance or NATO control. Defends African independence as core, objective, and essential mandate, not neo-colonial arrangements or post-colonial structures or Western-dominated systems. Let me be absolutely clear about what African alliance means in practice and operation. When I say serves African interests, I mean every operational decision is evaluated based on African security needs, African strategic priorities, African continental objectives. Not, does this serve Western interests? Not, does this align with NATO priorities? Not, does this support European objectives? Only, does this protect African sovereignty? Does this defend African independence? Does this serve African security? That's the evaluation. That's the standard. That's the criteria. Always, exclusively, permanently. When I say operates under African command, I mean African officers hold all command positions from continental commander down to unit leaders. Nigerian general commands West African Defense Center. South African general commands Southern African Defense Center. Egyptian general commands North African Defense Center. Kenyan general commands East African Defense Center. Congolese general commands Central African Defense Center. All African generals, all African officers, all African command. No NATO officers in command positions. No Western generals giving orders. No European commanders directing operations. African command, African leadership, African authority, complete, total, absolute. When I say makes African decisions, I mean Continental Command Council, composed of representatives from all 54 member nations, makes all strategic decisions, all operational choices, all policy determinations through collective African decision-making process. Decisions made in Addis Ababa, not Brussels. Choices determined in African capitals, not Western headquarters. Policies established by African governments, not NATO committees. Every major decision requires Continental Command Council approval. Every significant operation needs member nation consensus. Every important policy demands collective agreement. African decisions, African choices, African determinations, made by Africans, for Africans, serving African interests. When I say protects African sovereignty, I mean every operation is designed to defend African territorial integrity, political independence, economic autonomy, cultural identity, strategic freedom, operations against external threats to sovereignty, operations against internal destabilization, operations against neo-colonial interference, operations against foreign military intervention, operations against economic coercion, operations against political manipulation, all operations serving sovereignty protection, all missions defending independence, all activities preserving autonomy, African sovereignty, protected, defended, preserved, always. When I say defends African independence, I mean alliance exists to ensure African nations remain free from foreign control, external domination, Western manipulation, neo-colonial arrangements, post-colonial structures, independence from military occupation, independence from economic exploitation, independence from political interference, independence from cultural domination, independence from strategic subordination, complete independence, total freedom, absolute autonomy, defended, protected, guaranteed, permanently. NATO partnership is possible on equal terms, where both sides have equal voice, equal authority, equal decision-making power. NATO cooperation is acceptable with mutual respect, where both alliances respect each other's sovereignty, autonomy, independence. NATO engagement is welcome with genuine reciprocity, where benefits flow both directions, cooperation serves both interests, partnership advantages both sides. But NATO control is impossible under any circumstances or conditions. NATO dominance is unacceptable in any form or structure. NATO superiority is rejected completely and permanently. We cooperate as equals or not at all. No middle ground, no compromise, no subordination disguised as partnership. Let me explain exactly what equal terms means in practice. Equal terms means African Continental Defense Force and NATO have equal voice in joint planning. Neither alliance can veto others' decisions. Neither side can override others' choices. Neither party can dominate joint operations. Equal voice, equal authority, equal power. When we plan joint exercises, African officers and NATO officers have equal input. When we coordinate operations, African Command and NATO Command have equal authority. When we make decisions, African representatives and NATO representatives have equal votes. Equal. Not NATO decides and Africa follows, not NATO leads and Africa supports. Equal, genuinely, completely, absolutely. Equal terms means African Continental Defense Force maintains complete operational independence. We can conduct operations without NATO approval. We can deploy forces without NATO permission. We can execute missions without NATO authorization. NATO partnership doesn't mean NATO control. NATO cooperation doesn't imply NATO authority. NATO engagement doesn't create NATO dominance. We maintain independence. We preserve autonomy. We protect sovereignty. Always. Completely. Permanently. Equal terms means NATO respects African Continental Defense Force decisions even when disagreeing. If we decide to conduct operation NATO opposes, NATO respects our decision. If we choose strategy NATO questions, NATO accepts our choice. If we make policy NATO dislikes, NATO acknowledges our authority. Respect means accepting decisions you disagree with. Respect means acknowledging authority you don't control. Respect means recognizing sovereignty you can't override. Real respect. Genuine acknowledgement. Complete acceptance. Mutual respect means NATO respects African Continental Defense Force, sovereignty, autonomy, independence in all interactions and all circumstances. NATO doesn't pressure us to change decisions. NATO doesn't threaten us to modify policies. NATO doesn't coerce us to alter strategies. NATO respects our sovereignty. NATO acknowledges our autonomy. NATO accepts our independence. In all interactions, in all circumstances, in all situations, always, consistently, permanently. Mutual respect means African Continental Defense Force respects NATO sovereignty, autonomy, independence in reciprocal manner. We don't pressure NATO to change their decisions. We don't threaten NATO to modify their policies. We don't coerce NATO to alter their strategies. We respect NATO sovereignty. We acknowledge NATO autonomy. We accept NATO independence. Mutual respect, reciprocal acknowledgement, equal treatment, both directions, both alliances, both sides. Genuine reciprocity means benefits flow both directions in partnership with neither side exploiting other. African Continental Defense Force gains from NATO technology, training, experience. NATO gains from African Continental Defense Force regional knowledge, continental presence, local expertise, benefits both sides, advantages both alliances, serves both interests. Not one-way relationship where NATO benefits and Africa serves, not exploitative arrangement where NATO gains and Africa loses. Genuine reciprocity, real mutual benefit, actual two-way advantage. But NATO control is impossible under any circumstances, any conditions, any arrangements, any agreements. NATO dominance is unacceptable in any form, any structure, any system, any framework. NATO superiority is rejected completely, permanently, absolutely, definitively. We cooperate as equals or not at all. No middle ground, no compromise, no subordination disguised as partnership. No dominance hidden in cooperation language. No control masked by mutual benefit rhetoric. Equals or nothing, partnership or separation, respect or rejection, those are only options, only possibilities, only choices. Within 3 months of Operation Continental Shield, European powers began accepting new reality they couldn't change through pressure or manipulation or threats. NATO signed cooperation framework respecting African command autonomy in legally binding document. Document explicitly stated in clear, unambiguous language, African Continental Defense Force maintains complete operational independence in all matters. NATO cooperation does not imply command authority over African forces. NATO partnership does not create decision-making power over African operations. African alliance retains full decision-making autonomy in all circumstances. NATO respects African Continental Defense Force sovereignty absolutely. NATO acknowledges African alliance independence completely. NATO accepts African command authority permanently. Legal language, binding commitments, explicit guarantees. NATO forced to accept African independence legally. NATO required to acknowledge African sovereignty contractually. NATO compelled to respect African equality formally, in writing, in legal document, in binding agreement. no ambiguity, no loopholes, no escape clauses, clear, explicit, permanent. Document included specific provisions protecting African autonomy. NATO shall not attempt to influence African Continental Defense Force operational decisions through any means, including but not limited to diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, information withholding, equipment conditioning, training requirements, or any other direct or indirect method. Comprehensive protection, complete safeguards, total autonomy guaranteed. Document included enforcement mechanisms ensuring compliance. Any violation of African Continental Defense Force operational independence by NATO shall result in immediate suspension of cooperation framework. African alliance reserves right to terminate partnership at any time without NATO approval. NATO acknowledges African Continental Defense Force sole authority to determine partnership continuation. Strong enforcement. Clear consequences. African control over partnership. Document included dispute resolution favoring African position. Any disputes regarding interpretation of cooperation framework shall be resolved by joint committee with African Continental Defense Force holding tie-breaking authority. NATO acknowledges African alliance final decision-making authority in partnership matters. African authority, African control, African power, even in disputes, even in disagreements, even in conflicts. NATO forced to accept African independence through demonstrated military capability. NATO couldn't deny African Continental Defense Force was real, couldn't dismiss African military coordination as ineffective, couldn't claim African forces lacked capability. Operation African Unity proved coordination. Operation Continental Shield demonstrated capability. Continued exercises validated effectiveness. NATO faced reality. African military alliance was credible force, operational capability, professional competence, real power. NATO had to accept, had to acknowledge, had to respect. NATO required to acknowledge African sovereignty through political necessity. NATO needed African cooperation for counterterrorism. NATO wanted African intelligence for regional threats. NATO desired African partnership for strategic access, but African Continental Defense Force could refuse, could deny, could reject. NATO needed us more than we needed NATO. Political reality forced NATO acknowledgement. Strategic necessity required NATO respect. Operational requirements compelled NATO acceptance. NATO compelled to respect African equality through strategic calculation. NATO could oppose African Continental Defense Force, could refuse cooperation, could maintain hostility. But what would NATO gain? Nothing. What would NATO lose? African cooperation, African intelligence, African partnership. Strategic calculation was clear. Better to cooperate as equals than oppose and lose everything. Better to respect and maintain relationship than resist and lose access. Better to accept African equality than insist on NATO superiority and achieve nothing. Strategic calculation, rational choice. Practical decision. EU established dialogue mechanism without veto authority over African decisions through negotiated agreement. Regular consultations between EU and African Continental Defense Force. Monthly meetings. Quarterly strategic reviews. Annual comprehensive assessments. Information sharing on mutual threats. Intelligence coordination on shared concerns. Operational cooperation on common challenges. But no European control over African decisions. No Western veto over African choices. No neo-colonial authority over African policies. Regular consultations meant EU and African Continental Defense Force meet regularly to discuss security issues. EU presents European perspectives. African alliance presents African views. Both sides listen. Both sides consider. Both sides understand. But African Continental Defense Force makes final decisions. EU can advise. EU can suggest. EU can recommend. African alliance decides. African command chooses. African leadership determines. Consultation, not control. Discussion, not dominance. Dialogue, not dictation. Information sharing meant EU and African Continental Defense Force exchange intelligence on mutual threats. Terrorism, extremism, transnational crime, shared threats, common concerns. Mutual interests. Both sides share information. Both sides benefit from intelligence. Both sides enhance security. But African Continental Defense Force controls its own intelligence, decides what to share, determines what to withhold, maintains intelligence sovereignty. EU receives what African alliance chooses to share. EU doesn't demand, EU doesn't require, EU doesn't control. Information sharing, not intelligence subordination. Cooperation, not domination. But no European control over African decisions in any form or any circumstances. No Western veto over African choices under any conditions. No neo-colonial authority over African policies through any mechanism. African Continental Defense Force made decisions independently without European approval, made choices autonomously without Western permission, made policies sovereignly without neo-colonial authorization. EU could discuss, EU could consult, EU could engage, EU could not control, EU could not veto, EU could not dominate. Complete reversal from historical European dominance over African security. Total transformation from colonial control to equal partnership. Absolute change from subordination to sovereignty. African Continental Defense Force made decisions independently through Continental Command Council. Council composed of representatives from all 54 member nations. Each nation one vote. Each government equal voice. Each representative equal authority. Decisions made by majority vote. Policies determined by collective agreement. Strategies established by continental consensus. Democratic process. Collective decision-making, continental authority, no European participation, no Western votes, no NATO representation, African decisions by Africans for Africans. Serving African interests. EU could discuss African security issues in dialogue mechanism, could present European perspectives on threats, could share European analysis of challenges, could offer European suggestions for responses, could discuss, could present, could share, could offer, but could not decide, could not determine, could not control. EU input was advisory. EU suggestions were optional. EU recommendations were non-binding. African Continental Defense Force listened, considered, then decided independently. African decision, African choice, African authority. EU could suggest approaches to security challenges through consultation process, could recommend strategies for addressing threats, could propose operations for managing risks, could advise policies for handling issues, could suggest, could recommend, could propose, could advise. But African Continental Defense Force decided whether to accept suggestions, decided whether to implement recommendations, decided whether to adopt proposals, decided whether to follow advice. African decision-making, African authority, African sovereignty, complete, total, absolute. EU could not control African Continental Defense Force operations under any circumstances, could not veto African decisions through any mechanism, could not override African choices through any process, could not dominate African policies through any means. EU had no control, no veto, no override, no dominance, none, zero, never. African Continental Defense Force was sovereign, independent, autonomous, completely. Complete reversal from historical European dominance over African military affairs. Historical pattern was European powers controlled African security, European military bases dotted continent, European officers commanded African forces, European governments determined African defense policies, European interests shaped African military decisions, complete European dominance, total Western control. Absolute neo-colonial authority, that was history, that was past, that was yesterday. New reality was African Continental Defense Force controlled African security, African military bases protected continent, African officers commanded African forces, African governments determined African defense policies, African interests shaped African military decisions, complete African independence, total continental sovereignty, absolute indigenous authority. That was present. That was now. That was today. Transformation was revolutionary. From European control to African sovereignty, from Western dominance to continental independence, from neo-colonial authority to indigenous command, revolutionary change. Historic transformation, unprecedented shift, in security arrangements, in military relationships, in power dynamics, complete, total, absolute. France agreed to base closures in exchange for partnership opportunities with African alliance through negotiated settlement. All French military bases in alliance member nations would close within 12 months. Chad base closing by March 2026. Ivory Coast facilities terminating by June 2026. Gabon installations ending by September 2026. Senegal bases withdrawing by December 2026. All French military presence in alliance territories ending, all French troops departing, all French facilities dismantled, complete withdrawal, total departure, absolute termination. In exchange, France received partnership status with African Continental Defense Force, not command authority, not operational control, not decision-making power, just partnership status. What did partnership status include? Ability to participate in some joint exercises as observer, not participant, observer, watching, not commanding. Access to some intelligence sharing on mutual threats. Some intelligence, not all intelligence. What African alliance chose to share, not what France demanded. Opportunity to sell military equipment to alliance members. Opportunity, not guarantee, not requirement, not monopoly. Alliance members could buy French equipment or buy from other suppliers or produce indigenously. African choice, not French control. France went from occupying military bases across Africa to requesting partnership with African alliance, from stationing thousands of troops on African soil to observing African military exercises, from commanding African security operations to selling equipment to African forces, from controlling African defense policies to hoping for intelligence sharing, from dominating African military affairs to accepting partnership status, complete reversal, total transformation, absolute change, in 3 months, through African unity, through continental coordination, through collective strength. France went from controlling African security through military bases to cooperating on African terms through partnership agreement. From determining African defense through command authority to discussing African security through dialogue mechanism. From shaping African military through direct presence to engaging African forces through equal relationship. Revolutionary change, historic transformation, unprecedented reversal for France, for Africa, for history. Britain experienced similar transformation. British military bases in Kenya faced closure. British facilities in Ghana scheduled for termination. British presence across Africa ending. In exchange, Britain received similar partnership status, observer participation in exercises, limited intelligence sharing, equipment sales opportunities. Britain went from maintaining military presence to accepting partnership, from controlling security relationships to engaging as equal, from dominating through bases to cooperating through agreement. Complete reversal, total change, absolute transformation. Germany accepted African Continental Defense Force without maintaining military presence. Germany never had bases in Africa. Germany's influence was economic, not military. But Germany attempted to use economic leverage to prevent alliance formation. Threatened investment reductions, suggested trade complications, implied development assistance reconsideration. Economic pressure attempting to achieve what military presence couldn't, failed completely. African Continental Defense Force formed despite German pressure. Germany forced to accept reality, forced to acknowledge African sovereignty, forced to respect African independence, without gaining anything, without securing influence, without maintaining control, just acceptance, just acknowledgement, just respect, forced, required, compelled. EU established dialogue mechanism without veto authority over African decisions through formal agreement signed by both parties. Agreement specified. European Union and African Continental Defense Force establish regular dialogue mechanism for security consultation. Dialogue includes monthly working-level meetings, quarterly ministerial consultations, annual summit between EU leadership and Continental Command Council. Purpose is information exchange, perspective sharing, coordination discussion. EU has no veto authority over African Continental Defense Force decisions. EU has no override power over African alliance choices. EU has no control mechanism over African command policies. Regular consultations happened monthly at working level. EU security officials met with African Continental Defense Force coordination staff, discussed regional threats, shared threat assessments, exchanged analytical perspectives, professional engagement, respectful dialogue, equal interaction. But African Continental Defense Force made own decisions after consultations, considered EU input, evaluated EU suggestions, then decided independently. EU input was advisory. EU perspective was informational. EU suggestions were optional. African decision was final. African choice was determinative. African authority was absolute. Information sharing happened on African terms. African Continental Defense Force shared intelligence about threats affecting both Africa and Europe, terrorism threatening both continents, extremism affecting both regions, transnational crime impacting both areas, shared threats, mutual concerns, common interests, intelligence shared, information exchanged, analysis coordinated. But African Continental Defense Force controlled its own intelligence, decided what to share, determined what to withhold, maintained intelligence sovereignty. EU received what African alliance chose to provide. EU didn't demand intelligence. EU didn't require information. EU didn't control sharing. EU received. EU didn't control. But no European control over African decisions under any circumstances or conditions. EU couldn't veto African Continental Defense Force operations, even if EU disagreed completely. EU couldn't override African alliance deployments, even if EU opposed strongly. EU couldn't prevent African command decisions, even if EU objected strenuously. No control, no veto, no override. No prevention. None. Zero. Never. African Continental Defense Force was sovereign, independent, autonomous, completely, totally, absolutely. African Continental Defense Force made decisions independently through democratic continental process. Continental Command Council met monthly. Representatives from all 54 member nations. Each nation one vote. Each government equal voice. Each representative equal authority. Decisions required simple majority. 28 votes. Policies required 2/3 majority. 36 votes. Strategic changes required unanimous consent. 54 votes. Democratic process. Collective decision-making. Continental authority. Example decision-making. African Continental Defense Force decides to conduct operation in Sahel region. Continental Command Council meets. Representatives discuss operation. Nigerian representative supports. South African representative questions details. Egyptian representative suggests modifications. Kenyan representative endorses with amendments. Discussion continues. Perspective shared. Concerns addressed. Modifications incorporated. Vote taken. 32 nations support. 22 nations abstain. 0 nations oppose. Decision passes. Operation proceeds. African decision. African choice. African authority. EU wasn't consulted. NATO wasn't asked. Western approval wasn't sought. African decision. Made by Africans. For African security. EU could discuss operation after decision. Could express concerns. Could offer suggestions. Could provide input. But couldn't change decision. Couldn't veto operation. Couldn't prevent deployment. African Continental Defense Force had decided. Decision was final. Operation proceeded. EU discussed. African alliance executed. EU suggested. African command implemented. EU input was noted. African decision was executed. Discussion. Not control. Consultation. Not authority. Dialogue. Not dominance. EU could suggest alternative approaches to security challenges through consultation mechanism. Could recommend different strategies. Could propose alternative operations. Could advise different policies. EU could suggest. Could recommend. Could propose. Could advise. But African Continental Defense Force decided whether to accept suggestions, decided whether to implement recommendations, decided whether to adopt proposals, decided whether to follow advice. African decision-making, African authority, African sovereignty. EU input was advisory. EU suggestions were optional. EU recommendations were non-binding. African decisions were final. African choices were determinative. African authority was absolute. EU could not control African Continental Defense Force operations under any circumstances. Example, African alliance decides to conduct peacekeeping operation in Central African Republic. EU opposes operation. Thinks it's premature, believes situation isn't ready, recommends waiting, strong opposition, clear disagreement, firm recommendation against. But African Continental Defense Force proceeds anyway. EU opposition doesn't stop operation. EU disagreement doesn't prevent deployment. EU recommendation doesn't change decision. African alliance has decided, African command executes, African sovereignty prevails, EU discusses, African alliance acts, EU opposes, African command proceeds, EU recommends against. African decision stands. No EU control, no Western veto, no European authority, African sovereignty, African independence, African autonomy, complete, total, absolute. Complete reversal from historical European dominance over African military affairs, where European powers controlled everything. Historical European dominance meant European governments decided when African nations went to war. European officers commanded African military operations. European capitals determined African defense budgets. European industries supplied African military equipment. European trainers prepared African soldiers. European intelligence directed African security services. European interests shaped African military policies. Complete control, total dominance, absolute authority. That was colonialism. That was imperialism. That was history. Historical pattern continued after formal decolonization through neo-colonial arrangements. France maintained military bases in former colonies. Britain kept military facilities in former territories. European powers retained defense agreements. Western nations preserved security partnerships. Neo-colonial control continued. Post-colonial dominance persisted. European authority remained. Through bases, through agreements, through partnerships, through arrangements, control continued. Dominance persisted. Authority remained. Different form, same substance. New structures. Old power. New reality represented complete break from historical patterns. African Continental Defense Force controlled African security without European involvement. African command made decisions without Western approval. African officers led operations without European supervision. African governments determined policies without neo-colonial interference. African interests shaped strategies without foreign manipulation. Complete African control. Total continental authority. Absolute indigenous power. Revolutionary change. Historic transformation. Unprecedented shift. Transformation was comprehensive across all aspects of military affairs. Command structure, African, not European. Decision-making, African, not Western. Operations, African, not neo-colonial. Training, African, not foreign dependent. Equipment, increasingly African, not exclusively Western. Intelligence, African, not European controlled. Policies, African, not Western approved. Everything African, everything continental, everything indigenous, everything sovereign, everything independent, everything autonomous. Completely, totally, absolutely. France agreed to base closures representing end of French military presence in Africa. Symbolic significance enormous. France had maintained military bases in Africa since colonial era. Bases represented French power, French influence, French control. Bases enabled French intervention, French manipulation, French domination. Bases symbolized neo-colonialism, post-colonial control, continued European authority. Closing bases meant ending era, terminating control, eliminating presence, historic change, revolutionary transformation, unprecedented development. Chad Base was largest French military installation in Africa, 1,200 French troops. Advanced equipment, sophisticated facilities, strategic location, critical importance. France used Chad Base for operations across Sahel, for intelligence gathering across region, for power projection across Central Africa. Closing Chad Base eliminated French military capability in Central Africa, terminated French intervention capacity in Sahel, ended French power projection in region. Strategic loss for France, major victory for Africa, historic change for continent. Ivory Coast facilities represented French presence in West Africa. 950 French troops. Important equipment. Strategic facilities. France used Ivory Coast bases for operations in West African region, for monitoring West African governments, for intervening in West African affairs. Closing Ivory Coast facilities eliminated French military presence in West Africa, terminated French intervention capability in region, ended French dominance in area. Another strategic loss, another African victory, another historic change. Gabon installations represented French presence in Central Africa. 350 French troops, specialized equipment, strategic location. France used Gabon bases for operations in Central African region, for protecting French economic interests, for maintaining French political influence. Closing Gabon installations eliminated French military capability in Central Africa, terminated French economic protection, ended French political leverage, strategic loss, African victory, historic transformation. Senegal bases represented French presence in West Africa, 350 French troops. Historical significance, symbolic importance. France had maintained military presence in Senegal since colonial era, longest continuous French military presence in Africa. Closing Senegal bases had enormous symbolic significance, represented end of French military era in Africa, symbolized termination of neo-colonial security arrangements, demonstrated African sovereignty achievement, historic moment, revolutionary change, unprecedented development. In exchange for these base closures and complete military withdrawal, France received partnership status that was dramatically reduced from historical dominance. Partnership status included ability to participate in some joint exercises as observer, not command authority, observer status, watching African operations, not directing them, access to some intelligence sharing on mutual threats, some intelligence, not comprehensive access, what African alliance chose to share, not what France demanded. Opportunity to sell military equipment to alliance members, opportunity, not monopoly, not preference, not guarantee. Alliance members could buy French equipment if they chose, or buy elsewhere, or produce indigenously, African choice, not French control. France went from occupying military bases across Africa to requesting partnership with African alliance. Revolutionary reversal, historic transformation, complete change. From thousands of troops stationed to observer status at exercises, from command authority over operations to watching African command, from controlling security decisions to hoping for intelligence sharing, from dominating military affairs to selling equipment competitively, from neo-colonial power to equal partner, revolutionary change, historic transformation, unprecedented reversal. This transformation happened in 3 months through African unity and determination, 3 months from alliance announcement to European acceptance, 3 months from continental coordination to Western acknowledgement, 3 months from unified rejection of NATO expansion to European respect for African sovereignty. Rapid transformation, quick change, fast reversal, through African strength, through continental coordination, through collective determination, through unified action, through persistent resistance, through absolute commitment. Complete reversal from initial opposition where Europe tried everything to prevent alliance. Initial European opposition was comprehensive. Diplomatic pressure on African governments, economic threats against alliance supporters, media campaigns questioning military integration, intelligence operations attempting to prevent coordination, everything Europe could do, everything Western powers could attempt, everything neo-colonial forces could try, all failed, all defeated, all overcome, through African unity, through continental determination, through collective strength, complete reversal, total transformation, absolute change. France agreed to base closures in exchange for partnership opportunities with African alliance. French military bases in Chad closed. French facilities in Ivory Coast terminated. French presence in Gabon ended. French troops in Senegal withdrawn. All French military bases in alliance member nations closed. In exchange, France received partnership status with African Continental Defense Force, ability to participate in some joint exercises, access to some intelligence sharing, opportunity to sell military equipment, complete reversal. France went from occupying military bases to requesting partnership, from controlling African security to cooperating on African terms, from dominating militarily to engaging as partner. Total transformation. Complete reversal from initial opposition. Europe went from trying to prevent African military alliance to seeking partnership with African military alliance. From attempting to maintain military bases to accepting base closures, from resisting African military unity to acknowledging African military capability, from opposing African sovereignty to respecting African independence, revolutionary change, historic transformation, unprecedented reversal. I addressed alliance members in Continental Command headquarters, all member representatives present, historic gathering, first full alliance meeting. We succeeded despite European opposition, despite intelligence leak that exposed our plans prematurely, despite diplomatic pressure applied to prevent formation, despite economic threats designed to stop participation, Despite media campaigns questioning our capability, we succeeded because we were united, because we coordinated, because we persisted, because we believed. European powers tried everything to stop us, leaked our plans to create time for pressure, applied diplomatic pressure to prevent coordination, threatened economic consequences to discourage participation, conducted media campaigns to undermine confidence. Nothing worked. Because African unity is stronger than European opposition. Because continental coordination is more powerful than Western pressure. Because collective determination is more resilient than neo-colonial resistance. African Continental Defense Force is now operational, not planning, not developing, operational. Unified command functioning with professional staff, regional centers established with full capability. Integrated systems deployed and working. Continental military unity is reality, not aspiration. African security is fact, not hope. Continental defense is operational, not theoretical. This changes everything for Africa. Africa is no longer militarily fragmented with isolated national armies, no longer dependent on external security with foreign military presence, no longer vulnerable to foreign intervention with individual weakness. We defend ourselves with continental capability. We protect our sovereignty with unified strength. We secure our continent with collective power. I am Ibrahim Traoré, military officer, president, continental leader. Europe leaked my plan to unite African armies through intelligence operations. I built it anyway through determination and coordination. Europe tried to stop continental military alliance through pressure and threats. I completed it through unity and persistence. Europe panicked at unified African force through fear and anxiety. I made it reality through leadership and commitment. I don't accept European military dominance over African security. Don't maintain fragmented African defense serving Western interests. Don't depend on external security requiring foreign presence. I unify African armies through continental alliance, build continental defense through integrated systems, create military sovereignty through African capability. Europe leaked the plan through intelligence operations. I implemented it through determination. Europe applied pressure through diplomatic threats. I resisted through unity. Europe panicked through fear. I succeeded through strength. Your leak didn't stop me. Your pressure didn't break me. Your panic didn't slow me. Your opposition didn't prevent me. Your resistance didn't defeat me. I built it anyway. I will never stop. Your last mistake, my permanent achievement, your failed opposition, my successful creation, your wasted pressure, my realized vision. African Continental Defense Force is operational. 54 armies united, 2 million soldiers coordinated, largest military alliance functioning, continental command working, regional centers operating, integrated systems deployed, African sovereignty defended, continental security achieved, military independence realized, mission complete, vision achieved, promise fulfilled, Africa defended, sovereignty protected, independence secured, unity proven, strength demonstrated, capability validated, victory won. Forever. Permanently. Absolutely.